12 seconds after liftoff, the cockpit exploded in light. Not fire, not sparks, light. A blinding white flash that seemed to come from inside my skull. Then every warning alarm on the panel screamed at once. Red and amber lights lit up across the board, fuel cells offline, guidance platform gone, environmental control failing. Pete yelled, "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. My eyes were locked on the panel. It looked like the whole ship had just died while the Saturn V kept roaring upward beneath us. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. Alan muttered, "We just got hit," his voice trailed off, as if even he couldn't believe it. We had been struck by lightning. On a rocket carrying 3 million liters of propellant. The Saturn V didn't care. It kept pushing us higher, shoving us back into our couches with the force of 4 gs. But inside the command module Yankee Clipper, we were blind. The guidance system had shut down, the fuel cells weren't feeding power, and the alarms made it sound like we were seconds from becoming a fireball. Mission control crackled through the static. Apollo 12, we see multiple failures, stand by. Stand by. There was no standby when you were strapped to the top of a rocket moving at thousands of feet per second. Either we figured this out fast, or the mission, and our lives, ended right there. That's when the real fight began. For a few seconds after the flash, there was nothing but confusion. I kept my eyes on the console, scanning row after row of lights and dead indicators, trying to make sense of what had failed and what hadn't. It looked like almost everything had failed. The command module was running on emergency battery, the fuel cells had all dropped offline, and without those fuel cells we had no steady power for the systems that kept us alive. The guidance platform, which kept us aligned with the rocket beneath us, had gone dark. If it stayed that way, we would have no way to orient or control the spacecraft once we were in orbit. The Saturn V was still doing its job, pushing us higher and faster, but inside the cabin it felt like the spacecraft had been gutted. The worst part was the uncertainty. I didn't know if the lightning had damaged something permanent or just knocked the systems into chaos. Pete's voice was sharp, trying to cut through the noise. "Talk to me, Dick. What do you see?" I rattled off the list of failures. He swore and pounded his hand against his checklist. "Everything's gone to hell," he muttered. Alan was flipping switches beside me, checking his side of the panel, and he turned to me with his eyes wide behind the visor. "We've lost the platform completely. She's tumbling blind if this keeps up." I didn't have to say it out loud. If we couldn't restore power and the guidance platform, the mission was already over. We'd be lucky to survive re-entry. Mission control came through our headsets, calm but clearly shaken. "Apollo 12, we're seeing multiple malfunctions. Stand by, we're working the problem." Pete keyed his mic immediately. "Houston, we've lost fuel cells, lost the guidance platform, everything's in the red. We've been hit." His voice wasn't panicked, but there was no sugarcoating it. Seconds dragged on like hours. The Saturn V was pushing us past the thickest part of the atmosphere, vibrations rattling our teeth, acceleration forcing us into the couches. We were moving at thousands of feet per second, climbing toward space, and yet inside the cabin it felt like we were already dead in the water. Then Houston's voice broke in again, this time with urgency. "Apollo 12, try SCE to AUX, repeat, SCE to AUX." The words hung in the air for a moment. I froze. I had no idea what that meant. Neither did Pete. He shot me a look as if to ask if I had heard it right. Alan leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "SCE. Signal conditioning equipment," he said slowly, almost talking to himself. "AUX, auxiliary power." He glanced down at the switch panel on his side. "I think I know where that is." His gloved hand reached out, searching, flipping covers open. He found a tiny switch almost hidden among dozens of others and snapped it to AUX. The effect wasn't immediate, but one by one, some of the dead instruments began to flicker back to life. The main displays steadied. Telemetry started returning. The alarms didn't go silent, but the flood of failures slowed. Pete exhaled sharply. "Good call, Houston. Al, you just saved our ass." Alan didn't answer, just kept staring at the panel to see if it would hold. I finally felt my own shoulders loosen against the couch. We weren't out of danger, not even close, but for the first time since the flash, we had a path forward. The realization hit me hard. The only reason that switch was even in our minds was because Al had remembered his training in a simulator months earlier, when a technician had casually mentioned that strange little switch as a last resort for instrumentation failures. If he hadn't recalled that at that exact moment, we would have lost the entire mission within the first minute of flight. Houston came back, more composed now. "Apollo 12, we're seeing good telemetry. Keep monitoring fuel cells." Pete responded, "Copy, Houston. We're holding." That was one hell of a ride. His voice carried a tight laugh, the kind you use when you're not sure if you should be relieved or terrified. I kept scanning the gauges. 2 of the 3 fuel cells were slowly coming back online, though their output was shaky. The third looked dead. With 2 working, we could limp through most of the mission, but it meant running close to the edge. Power was life, and we'd already lost part of ours. The Saturn V's first stage cut off, and the jolt threw us forward in our straps before the next stage ignited. The thunder changed pitch, less violent but still relentless. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might miss Houston's next call. Pete was calm on the radio, reading back numbers, acting like nothing unusual had happened. But when he wasn't transmitting, I could hear his breathing through the intercom, heavy and fast. Alan finally leaned back and shook his head. "Lightning, for God's sake. Who gets hit by lightning in the middle of a moon launch?" None of us answered. It was a question without an answer. The second stage burned smoothly, and for the first time since the flash, I let myself believe we might actually make orbit. My mind kept replaying those first seconds, the flash, the alarms, the dead panels, and how close we had come to aborting or worse. We had been a few switch flips away from ending Apollo 12 before it had even begun. The moon had felt impossibly far when we were strapped into the rocket on the pad. In that moment, with the storm still alive outside, the moon felt further than ever. When the engines finally cut off and the weightlessness set in, I felt my stomach float and my body rise against the straps. The violent shaking was gone, replaced by the eerie silence of orbit. Pete looked over at us, sweat beading on his forehead. "Well, boys," he said with a crooked grin, "we made it through the fun part." Alan laughed once, but it sounded hollow. I didn't laugh at all. My hands were still trembling too much. We were in space, but the mission had already taken us to the edge. The question now wasn't whether we had made it, it was how much damage had been done, and whether we could still reach the moon with half-crippled systems. That answer would come soon enough. Weightlessness should have felt like relief after the crushing acceleration, but I could not relax. My stomach floated and my body lifted slightly in the straps, yet my eyes were fixed on the gauges, watching to see if the fuel cells would hold. The cabin smelled of plastic and machine oil, mixed with a sharp tang from the burned circuits that had taken the lightning hit. Pete was talking to Houston, giving status reports as though we had just completed a routine ascent, but I knew he was forcing the calm into his voice. Alan was quiet, still staring at the panel as if daring it to go dark again. Houston finally came through in a steadier tone. "Apollo 12, we're showing stable power on fuel cells 1 and 2. 3 looks lost. Guidance platform alignment is degraded but recoverable. Your go for orbital insertion." Pete replied immediately, "Copy that, Houston. Standing by for circularization." Then he looked at me and Al, "All right, let's not screw this up. We're not going home yet." I checked my side of the board again. 2's holding at nominal load. 1's lagging but alive. We can live with this if they don't drop again. Alan added, "Platform will need a full realignment before translunar injection." If the stars are visible, I can reset it manually. Pete gave a sharp nod. Then we keep going until they tell us to stop. That was the truth of it. We might have been the ones strapped inside the spacecraft, but the decision about whether Apollo 12 continued belonged to mission control. I knew they were weighing everything, the risk of continuing toward the moon with a crippled command module, the political cost of aborting a mission only months after the triumph of Apollo 11, and the simple fact that we had already survived something most crews would not. The first orbits were spent testing and retesting. Every switch was flipped, every system run through checklists. My hands were damp inside the gloves as I held a checklist pad, calling out numbers for Houston to confirm. Power was adequate but thin. With only 2 fuel cells, we had no margin. Lose one more and we would have to shut down major systems just to stay alive. Guidance was shaky until Alan began carefully realigning the platform, using the stars that now came into view beyond the Earth's horizon. His voice was calm as he read the sightings, but I could hear the strain under it. Every reading mattered. "Mark," Alan said, pressing the button as he lined up the optics. "Star Vega, 094.2. I logged it. Houston read it back. "Copy Vega, 094.2. We worked through a dozen alignments like that. Slowly the platform came back into tolerance. When it finally stabilized, Alan leaned back, exhausted, and muttered, "That's the best we're going to get." Pete grinned, though it was tight. "That'll take us to the moon if they let us go." After the platform alignment, we waited for the decision. The silence in the cabin felt heavy. I imagined the rows of controllers in Houston, each one arguing whether we were fit to continue. We couldn't hear those debates, but we could feel them. The minutes stretched, each one longer than the last. Finally the call came. "Apollo 12, Houston. You are go for translunar injection." Alan looked at me, eyebrows raised. I just shook my head slowly, half in disbelief. Pete whooped into the microphone, "Roger, Houston, go for TLI. Let's light this candle again." Despite the humor in his words, the burn was tense. The third stage ignited, and the rumble pressed us into the couches once more. The numbers on the display climbed, velocity ticking higher, Earth slipping away behind us. I kept my eyes on the fuel cell readouts, willing them not to budge. If one failed mid-burn, we would be stranded between worlds with barely enough power to survive. But they held. When the burn cut off, we were on a trajectory for the moon. Pete clapped his hands together and shouted, "Gentlemen, we're not dead yet." Alan chuckled, though it sounded forced, and said, "Let's hope Houston still thinks this is a good idea when we get there." We settled into the long coast. The adrenaline drained from me slowly, leaving a strange emptiness. I floated in my couch, helmet off now, sweat drying on my forehead, trying to absorb what had happened. In training, we rehearsed failures again and again, but no one had ever trained us for a lightning strike at launch. The only reason we were still on our way to the moon was because Alan had remembered a switch most of us barely knew existed, and because Houston had a controller who shouted it out at exactly the right second. Without those 2 moments, Apollo 12 would have been nothing but a brief, tragic firework above Florida. Pete finally looked at us both, his grin fading. "Listen, we're going to do this mission. But I want it clear, if either of you think we're pushing too far, you say it. No questions. We already rolled the dice once." Alan nodded. "If we lose another cell, we're finished. But if they hold, I think we can land." I said nothing for a long moment, just looking out the window at the thin curve of Earth receding into the black. Finally I said, "We can land. But it won't take much to turn this ride home into a coffin." Nobody argued. We all knew it. The first day on the way to the moon was nothing like the calm cruise we had practiced in the simulators. In training, the coast phase was routine, checklists, meal packs, exercise, navigation updates. Instead, ours was consumed by the constant monitoring of every line of the power systems, every reading from the fuel cells, every indicator that might tell us whether the lightning strike had left a hidden wound inside the spacecraft. I floated at my station with the telemetry sheets strapped to my leg board, pencil in hand, calling numbers down to Houston every 15 minutes. 2 fuel cells carried us well enough, but the third remained dead. The controllers reminded us every hour that losing another would mean shutting down everything but the bare minimum: environmental systems, guidance, and radios. The command module would become little more than a cold can with just enough power to keep 3 men breathing until Earth pulled us back down. Pete kept his usual humor on the open line, but when his mic was off, his eyes showed the strain. He would push himself away from his couch and drift to the panel, pressing his helmet close to the gauges as if he could will them to behave. Alan stayed quieter, absorbed in his optics work, refining the platform alignment with sightings on the stars. He would mutter numbers under his breath and then call them out firmly, waiting for me to log them and for Houston to confirm. The whole cabin was filled with the sounds of switches being flipped, checklists being read, pencils scratching against paper, and the steady hiss of the air system. I remember one conversation vividly. It was late into that first shift, and Houston had just asked for another round of detailed power readings. I read them out while Pete hovered nearby. Fuel cell 1, 41.2 amps. Fuel cell 2, 42.8. Cabin voltage, 28.1. Houston read them back and then added, "Copy, Apollo 12. We're stable for now. Keep monitoring." Pete snorted and said to us, "Stable. That's a nice word when your whole ship just got fried." Alan looked up from the optics and said evenly, "Stable means alive. I'll take it." As the hours passed, the tension slowly shifted from panic into an exhausting vigilance. Every task we performed carried the weight of wondering if it would be the one that tripped another failure. Eating was mechanical: tear open a package, squeeze out the food, swallow quickly, and get back to the numbers. Sleep was nearly impossible at first. When I finally strapped myself into the couch and closed my eyes, the only thing I could see was the flash of that lightning and the dead panels. I drifted in and out, waking every time a new call came from Houston or Pete's voice carried across the cabin. By the second day, we began to believe the systems might hold. 2 fuel cells were not ideal, but they were steady. The guidance platform stayed aligned. Communications were clear. Mission Control grew more confident in their calls, and we stopped hearing the constant "stand-by" that had filled the first hours. We still had to prove the lunar module was undamaged. That would be the real test. When it came time to separate the command module from the third stage and dock with the lunar module, my stomach tightened again. The lightning had flowed through the entire stack at launch. If it had damaged the lunar module systems, we would not know until we powered it up. Docking itself was routine. I took the controls, maneuvered the command module slowly forward, lined up the probe and drogue, and captured the LM. The metal clang echoed through the cabin when the latches engaged. Pete gave a small cheer, but we all knew that was only the beginning. We opened the tunnel and moved through into the lunar module, which Pete and Alan would later fly to the surface. The smell was different in there, newer, almost raw, with the faint bite of uncured plastics. We began powering up its system step by step, reading off currents, voltages, displays. For an hour, we waited for a warning light to betray hidden damage. None came. The LM was alive. Pete finally exhaled and slapped the side panel with his glove. "She's ready to go." Houston confirmed what we already felt. "Apollo 12, LM systems check is good. You are go for lunar operations." The words filled the cabin like oxygen. For the first time since the launch, I let myself believe we might actually land. That night, as we floated through our rest period, I spoke quietly to Alan. Pete was already asleep, strapped in and breathing steadily. "Did you think we'd still be here?" I asked. He floated near the window, looking out at the distant curve of Earth. "No," he admitted. "When the lights went out, I thought it was over. I figured we'd abort and be back in the water by now. He paused, his face half lit by the glow from the panel. But we're still going. That means something. I thought about that long after he drifted off. We were not flying a perfect mission. We were flying a wounded one, patched together by instinct, training, and luck. Yet we were still flying, still on course for the moon. The resolution was not clean, not final, but it was enough. We had bought ourselves a chance to continue. The closer we drew to lunar orbit, the quieter the cabin became. We were still performing our duties, still running through checklists and sending data down to Houston, but the chatter that usually filled the ship had slowed. Pete still cracked the occasional line, but even he had started speaking less. We all knew what was ahead, the split. He and Alan would take the lunar module down to the surface, and I would remain in the command module, alone, circling the moon. Normally, that part of the mission carried its own weight, but for us it came after days of wondering if the lightning strike had planted hidden failures inside our systems. We had made it through ascent, through translunar injection, through the long coast, and through the checkout of the lunar module, but none of that erased the fact that our ship had already been pushed beyond what any spacecraft was meant to endure. The night before undocking, we strapped in and tried to rest. The cabin lights were dim, and the quiet hum of the fans was the only constant sound. I could not sleep. My eyes stayed open, fixed on the faint glow of the instrument panel, and my thoughts kept circling back to that blinding flash above Florida. I finally unstrapped, floated across to Alan, and tapped his arm. He stirred, eyes opening slowly. "You awake?" I asked. "I am now," he muttered, pulling himself upright. I floated beside him for a moment before saying, "Do you think this ship is going to hold?" He rubbed his face with both hands and then looked straight at me. "I don't know, Dick. We've tested everything we can test. The numbers are good. But we both know numbers don't always tell the truth. If something was burned deep inside the wiring, we won't find out until it fails." I nodded slowly. "And if it fails while you two are on the surface?" Alan's jaw tightened. "Then you'll have to make a call no one wants to make." Neither of us spoke for a while after that. The thought was too heavy to put into more words. If the command module failed while they were on the surface, I would be left with an impossible choice: attempt to bring them back when I could not guarantee life support, or leave them there with no way home. It was a thought every command module pilot carried, but for me it was sharper now because of the lightning. We were already closer to that edge than any of us wanted to admit. Pete stirred then, opening his eyes. He looked at us both and asked, "What are you two whispering about?" "Whether we trust this ship," I answered plainly. He gave a tired laugh. "I trust it enough to get down there and back. And that's all I need. Look, we've come this far. If Houston thought we were in real danger, they would have called it. But they didn't. That means they believe we can finish this job." Alan said quietly, "Belief isn't the same as certainty." Pete leaned forward in his couch and looked at both of us. "Listen. We knew this job wasn't certain when we signed up. You think Apollo 11 was certain? You think Apollo 8 was certain, when they went around the moon without ever testing the rocket that far? Every one of these flights is a gamble. Lightning just reminded us of that. But we're here now, and I'll be damned if I let that storm stop us from landing." His words carried conviction, but they didn't erase the tension in the cabin. When Pete drifted back down and closed his eyes again, Alan whispered to me, "He'll never admit it, but he's worried too. He just hides it better." I said, "That's his job. Ours is to keep this ship alive long enough for him to do what he came here for." Alan nodded, and we sat there in silence until he finally strapped back in and closed his eyes again. I stayed awake for a long time, listening to the hum of the systems, watching the gauges, waiting for a flicker that never came. The next day, as we prepared for undocking, Mission Control came through with their usual steady voices. "Apollo 12, you are go for separation. We'll see Intrepid on the surface." Pete responded, "Copy, Houston. We're go for separation." Then he turned to me. "All right, Dick. You've got the big bird. Don't let her bite." I smiled faintly but didn't answer right away. Finally I said, "I'll keep her alive. Just make sure you come back." Alan gave me a long look, the kind that didn't need words. He understood exactly what I meant. Pete grinned, but his eyes softened for just a second. "We'll be back. Count on it." That was the last real conversation we had before they climbed into the lunar module and sealed the hatch. It was practical, but it carried the weight of everything we had been through. None of us said the things that hung in the air, that this could be the last time we spoke, that the mission might claim one or all of us, but the silence after the hatch closed said it for us. I floated there alone in the command module, listening to the metallic thud of the latches engaging, and I thought about how close we had come to never even leaving Earth. Now we were about to split the crew, trusting two fragile ships, each with scars we could not see, to carry us through the most dangerous part of the mission. When Pete and Alan undocked in the lunar module, the command module suddenly felt twice as empty. The constant exchange of voices, the small jokes, the sound of someone shifting in their couch, all of it was gone. I floated alone in Yankee Clipper, strapped at my console, listening to their voices crackle over the radio as they began their descent. My job was to monitor the command module and stay in contact, ready to step in if Houston needed another pair of eyes. But mostly, I listened. Their descent was tense. Every call from Houston, every response from Pete and Alan, carried the weight of the unknown. The lunar module had survived the lightning strike in testing, but this was its true trial. If its power or guidance faltered halfway down, they would be in serious danger. I tracked their telemetry as best I could, relaying numbers when Houston asked, and held my breath each time there was a pause in communications. Finally, after what felt like an endless sequence of calls and corrections, Pete's voice broke through with triumph. "Houston, Intrepid has landed." I felt the breath rush out of me, even though I wasn't the one down there. For a moment, the command module was filled only with the sound of my own laugh, sharp and almost disbelieving. They were on the surface of the moon. Against all odds, after the lightning, after the near abort, Apollo 12 had placed 2 men safely on another world. I congratulated them over the circuit, and Alan's voice came back with a grin audible even through the static. "Wish you were down here, Dick. It's a hell of a sight." For the next day, I orbited the moon alone. I performed the routine tasks, photography, navigation updates, system checks, but the solitude pressed hard. Each time I passed over the near side, I could hear Pete and Alan describing the strange, gray landscape, the equipment they were setting up, the samples they were collecting. Their excitement was genuine, but between their transmissions, silence returned, and I floated in a ship that felt larger than it ever had with 3 aboard. I looked out the window at the moon's surface below and then at the black horizon where Earth was a distant blue sphere. For the first time, I truly felt the scale of where we were. During one pass, Houston patched me into a private line. The Capcom said, "Dick, just want you to know, everything you're doing up there is exactly what we need. Keep it steady. They'll be back with you soon." I thanked him, but what I wanted to say was that it was not easy to sit and wait while my crewmates took the steps every astronaut dreamed of. I had trained knowing my role would not include walking on the surface, but training is different from reality. Now that the moon was right there, close enough to see every crater in detail, it was harder than I had expected to accept that I would never touch it. 2 days later, it was time for them to lift off. I positioned the command module, ran through the rendezvous procedures, and waited. The lunar module's ascent engine ignited, and I tracked their path on the display, guiding them in until the small craft finally appeared in my window. I maneuvered forward, captured them with the docking probe, and pulled them in. The metallic clang as the latches engaged echoed through the cabin. Seconds later, the tunnel hatch opened, and I saw their faces again, streaked with dust and exhaustion but grinning from ear to ear. Pete clapped me on the shoulder as he floated through. "Told you we'd be back." Alan pulled himself into his couch, still clutching a small sample bag. "You wouldn't believe the view down there," he said, his voice hoarse. I smiled and answered, "I'll take your word for it." We spent hours transferring samples, stowing equipment, and shutting down the lunar module. When it was finally time to jettison it, I guided the command module away and watched as the small craft drifted off, a used-up shell that had done its job. There was a strange sadness in seeing it float into the void. That little ship had carried half our crew to the surface of another world and back, and now it would be left to decay in lunar orbit, a silent relic of the gamble we had taken. The journey home felt calmer than the trip out, though we never stopped watching the fuel cells. They held, steady to the end. Re-entry was violent as always, the roar, the fire outside the windows, the crushing deceleration, but after what we had lived through at launch, it almost felt routine. When the parachutes opened and the capsule hit the water, I finally allowed myself to believe it was over. We were pulled from the ocean, tired, sore, still smelling of the cabin after more than a week inside it, but alive. The medical checks, the congratulations, the cameras, those blurred together. What stayed with me was the memory of those first seconds after the lightning strike, when it seemed impossible that we would even survive ascent. Everything after that felt like borrowed time, and yet we had gone on to complete the mission, to land on the moon, and to return. In the days after, when the celebrations faded and the routine of debriefings began, I thought about what Apollo 12 really meant. To the public, it was the second moon landing, proof that Apollo 11 had not been a one-time miracle. To us, it was something else. It was the reminder that every flight was fragile, that survival often came down to quick thinking, training, and luck combined. Alan remembered a switch. Houston had someone who recognized what to do. Pete kept the crew steady. Each piece mattered, and without any one of them, we would not have made it. For me, it was also a lesson in acceptance. I had not walked on the moon. I had watched it pass below me, close yet untouchable. But I had kept the ship alive, and I had brought my crewmates home. That was my role, and it mattered just as much as the footprints they left in the dust. When people asked later if I regretted not walking on the surface, I told them the truth: the mission was never about me alone. It was about all of us together, facing risks we could barely calculate, and coming back to tell the story. Apollo 12 did not begin as planned, and it could have ended in disaster within seconds of launch. Instead, it proved that even when everything seems lost, a crew and a team on the ground can pull a mission back from the edge. That is what I carried with me afterward, more than the records or the photographs. We had been tested by fire and thunder, and we had returned. That was enough.